Good evening. A unique day in American history is ending, a day set aside for a nationwide outpouring of mankind seeking its own survival. Earth Day.
We are 50 years to the day from the very first Earth Day on April 22nd, 1970. And I'm so honored to have Denis Hayes, one of the principal organizers, the founder of Earth Day, joining us today, especially when he's hung out with way cooler people than I am, like Zac Efron. For those of you who haven't met Denis, just a few highlights from his biography include serving as the director of the Solar Energy Research Institute, which is now the National Renewable Energy Lab under the Carter administration. He has received countless awards from everybody, the National Wildlife Federation to the Interfaith Center for Corporate Responsibility. Time Magazine honored him as one of its heroes of the planet. As president of the Bullitt Foundation, he designed and constructed the world's greenest office building. And today, he's here to talk with us about his experience with Earth Day. He was the principal organizer for the national first Earth Day in 1970. Denis, I've been so inspired by your story ever since I met you 2 years ago. So I'm gonna start our interview by telling people really, the spoiler alert, what I hope you get out of this. A good part of my career focused on environmental education, and call me naive, but I thought that it was born out of a time when we were much more at peace with our planet. The days of tie-dye and braided hair and flower crowns and peace signs. But Denis taught me that's far from the truth, which we'll get into in just a minute. Today we can feel powerless and overwhelmed and even crushed by global events. The current pandemic, fires raging through the Amazon and Australia, and really any report that comes out from the IPCC telling us we only have a certain number of years until we'll start seeing major catastrophic changes in our climate. It's really easy to feel powerless and that taking action is useless. A lot of this is because we're in the middle of it. We can't see where this ends up because we're in the middle of it. But if we look at history, we'll see that we as businesses, as communities, as individuals, have overcome environmental challenges, that we have the ability to change, and that we have to keep trying. Earth Day is now celebrated in 190 countries. It's the most celebrated secular holiday in the world. If that can arise out of the chaos and divisiveness of the 1960s, we can figure out the challenges that lie ahead of us. So I hope this story gives you some inspiration. So thank you so much, Denis, for being with us. And I'd like to just start in with that very fact. Tell us what the world was like when the first Earth Day came to be, and why was Earth Day necessary?
Well, through the 1960s in the United States, there was a growing gap between the traditional economic definition of prosperity, a rising gross domestic product, and a great many things that were important to people, the quality of the air that they were breathing, clean water to drink or fish in or swim in, the way the toxics were being disposed of, the risk of extinction that was facing many American species, including our national emblem, the bald eagle. And you can go on and on with this sort of litany of problems that, although the way that we thought about ourselves, we're getting better and better every year, we're getting richer, somehow the quality of life wasn't keeping pace with that. In major American cities like Pittsburgh, Gary, Indiana, Los Angeles, there were medical studies saying that breathing was the equivalent of smoking 2 packs of cigarettes a day. When it suddenly dawned upon young women who were 25, 26, 27 years old and had a 6-month-old baby, that their baby was smoking 2 packs of cigarettes a day, of course, that was pretty upsetting. And within this broad context, Senator Gaylord Nelson from Wisconsin had a sense that the time might be right to try to call attention to these events. So he proposed a teach-in on college campuses that was focused on the environment. And initially, I was supposed to be going out and saying if I could stir up those teach-ins. It turns out that college campuses at that time were not much interested in the environment. We had a war going on in Southeast Asia. The civil rights movement was moving into a particularly difficult period after the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King. Huge cultural upheavals in the country between the Woodstock generation, the summer of love in San Francisco, and the prevailing attitudes and values of the Midwest, the Deep South. And amidst all of that chaos, it was hard to get folks on college campuses to focus on the environment, but pretty easy to get those young women, 22 to 25, 30 years old, often college educated, frequently in a single wage earner family, for whom this issue of the world that their kids would be inheriting just resonated very strongly. And so we moved it off of college campuses out into communities, moved away from the name Environmental Teach-In and into Earth Day, and it began to blossom.
Well, so blossom it did. I mean, 20 million people showed up for the first Earth Day. And again, I need to remind people that was without social media, that was without email. I mean, I'm flabbergasted at how you were able to organize that many people to do anything. And shortly after, President Nixon created the EPA. We passed the Clean Air and Clean Water Acts, the Endangered Species Act. I mean, there was a lot of movement that happened directly after the first Earth Day. Did you ever think it would catch on?
No, the model that we were building from once we got off of college campuses and out into communities was the sort of model that filled the 1960s of having a very large crowd. If you can turn out a lot of people, if you can generate attention from the television networks and the major news magazines, then that would help raise the profile of an issue. And so our model was something akin to the March on the Pentagon, or the Poor People's March, or the March in Selma. It's an event that you spend some period of time trying to organize. If you're successful, you get a week or two of attention, and it goes away. It was a one-shot deal. I never dreamed that there would be an Earth Day in 1971, much less one in 2020, and that it would have grown to basically be a global phenomenon. Virtually every country in the world now participates. And in fact, I think last year, in all probability, more people participated in Earth Day in India than it did in the United States. That sort of thing was not at all on our minds in 1970. We were hoping to have something that was in the same order as those events that had been pulled together by the anti-war movement, the civil rights movement.
So what do you think were some of the key factors that by luck or happenstance came together to really, project you forward, to really give you momentum?
Well, lots of things. I mean, the self-serving answer is just brilliant organization, but I think you're right. There were a lot of external variables that were very helpful. One was that this was taking place in a time when a few environmental issues were getting a higher degree of prominence than usual. Rachel Carson had written a best-selling book about the impact of pesticides on birds. We just had the Santa Barbara oil spill. We just had the Cuyahoga River in Cleveland catch on fire. There'd just been a major report that got a lot of attention suggesting that the Great Lakes were beginning to die in terms of the life support capacities of the Great Lakes. And all of those things were out there. It was a time when the interstate freeway system, which had begun under Eisenhower, had finished all of its freeways in between cities and now wanted to go through cities to connect itself, which meant it was passing through vibrant inner city neighborhoods and slashing through them and destroying them. And so there's a vibrant anti-freeway movement. Air pollution, which had been a problem for a long time, was now coming to be recognized as a problem. So we had all of those things coming together. In addition, the 60s in many ways sort of was a decade that was tearing America apart. Just violent oppositions, opposing ideas on what is the appropriate approach to particularly the war and to civil rights issues. The environment, unlike those issues, it's somewhat less subject to debate. I mean, there are different people with different policy formulations. Some wanted to internalize the external and costs and put it as price of objects. Others wanted to use regulations. Others wanted to use voluntary activities. You could have that kind of debate, but there was nobody out there saying, boy, we just don't have enough pollution. Let's see if we can generate more. We've got too many species. Let's see if we can drive some of them into extinction. I mean, we were on an issue where there was a consensus that we were heading in the wrong direction, and that the question wasn't whether we should turn ourselves around, it was how best to do that.
What did it feel like to be part of, again, all these happenstance, maybe some political, maybe some community grassroots things all coalescing, starting to go in a similar direction?
Well, this is part of an even broader phenomenon. When we talk about it, when I was talking about it just now, we talk about the civil rights movement, the anti-war movement, the women's movement, the environmental movement. By and large, in the 60s and 70s, these were many of the same people, including many of the same leaders. Reverend Martin Luther King gave very spirited and very profound anti-war speeches. It was really tying environmental things into the rest of the movement. So when we were making sure that the anti-war protesters were not going to be viewing us as a distraction or an enemy, we had a lot of focus upon the use of Agent Orange, an herbicide that wiped out massive amounts of vegetation, fertile mangrove groves, but were replaced with relatively sterile bamboo after they began to recover, but that also had an impact upon the people that it fell on. It caused mutagenicity in stillborn babies, and a real tragedy, as well as dire health effects for the American servicemen who found themselves underneath it. When we were talking to civil rights organizations, the focus was upon lead paint that was peeling off the walls of ghettos and being eaten by really young children because it is sort of sweet tasting, but it damages their nervous systems permanently. And about same sort of thing with the leaded gas and gasoline, which settled down into the poorest neighborhoods in town. And those freeways that were cutting through cities, they weren't cutting through Beverly Hills, they were cutting through South Central. They were cutting through the neighborhoods that did not have the political clout, did not have the financial resources to be able to protect themselves. So all of this was tied together as the movement. And I was very pleased to be able to participate in bringing another dimension to it. In that particularly things like the anti-war movement, the fear was that all of this energy is going into this movement, and in the end it will succeed. But then what happens is you bring your troops home and there are no lasting structural institutional changes for the better. You've just stopped something bad from continuing. The environmental contribution to that, much like the civil rights contribution, was a vision of something that would be a permanent, profound, fundamental change in the nature of the country. And I'll say as well that wave of legislation that followed Earth Day, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the Endangered Species Act, the Toxic Substances Control Act, the National Forest Protection Act, the Marine Mammal Protection Act, Superfund, National Environmental Education Act. If you add all of those things up and the trillions and trillions of dollars that were spent having passed a benefit cost ratio test to make it a healthier, cleaner society, I think there has been nothing in the course of American history, with the possible exception of the New Deal, that has had a more profound long-term effect upon the American economy, American values, the way that we lead our lives. And of course, the New Deal was brought to us by a hugely popular president coming out of the Great Depression, whose political party controlled both houses of Congress. The environmental movement was from the ground up. It possessed none of those strengths.
On a lighter note, what's the favorite Earth Day celebration you've had? Which year was it, and why?
For my personal favorite, boy, I it was clearly supposed to be 2020. We've spent 3 years, or almost 3 years, trying to organize the biggest outpouring in human history, north of 1 billion people that would be all calling for dramatic change, particularly in the climate sphere, sort of a global Green New Deal. And the coronavirus turned out to be the ultimate black swan. If what you're trying to do is organize massive events, and suddenly it is illegal to have more than 10 people gathered together, that pretty well puts an end to all of the work that you've done. I guess in retrospect, I would have to go back to the very first one. And maybe even within that, the moment when I first climbed up onto a stage on Fifth Avenue in New York, a long time ago, but my sense is that I climbed a long way. It was 60, 70 feet in the air, looking out at the crowd in front of me, and it was sort of like looking at a human ocean. There were people out beyond the visual horizon. And that was the first time that I realized this thing that I had been working on so very hard was not only going to be big in the terms that the previous events of the 1960s had been big, but that it was ginormous, that I had never encountered in anything else, something that began to approach this size. And that was in one city. And we had things in hundreds of cities across the country that led to those enormous numbers. So I guess at the end of April 22nd in 1970, completely exhausted, I nonetheless returned to my apartment feeling satisfied. This thing had really exceeded not only my expectations, it had vastly exceeded my greatest hopes for it.
That kind of gets to another interesting question I had for you, just on a personal level. After you've kind of put all this effort into this, I'll say seasonal day, what's the first thing you do to kind of recover or restore for yourself?
A strange little secret about someone who, to the extent that people have heard of me at all, they associate me with large crowd events, is I actually don't like crowds very much. There's something that is wild and unpredictable. One of the biggest things whenever we're putting together large events is you really want to have a well-trained security force. You necessarily have bought crowd insurance against the things that can go wrong. You never know when some wacko is going to do something stupid. And I just, there can easily develop almost something that can range anywhere from the kind of cheering you have at an athletic contest to a sense of community and joint fervor, all the way over to almost a mob mentality. So after I get through that and we've escaped unscathed one more time and have had this huge number of people demanding a change that will make the world permanently a better place, I like to be off by myself. And my retreat is typically to throw on a backpack and head out, now that I live in the Pacific Northwest, into the North Cascades someplace, and have a small one-person tent and a sleeping bag and some food, and just have a chance to totally decompress and come back a few days later.
Connect to nature out there.
Connect to nature and also connect to myself, to actually look into my soul in a way that you don't when you're slamming out 16, 18-hour days for long periods of time, handling details and arguments.
Yes. The true intent of Earth Day, at least the way I've interpreted it, is to remind us that the earth matters all year long. And that really it's not about just in April. And that couldn't be more true this year, where a number of events, as you just mentioned, have had to either be postponed or changed because we can't organize events this April. What part of Earth Day do you hope people take with them all year long?
The values that underpin Earth Day are those of resilience and sustainability and public health and biological diversity. What I hope that people will be carrying with them after Earth Day is the importance of that in a world where most things are assigned dollar value, and when you say what something's worth, you're typically talking about the dollar aspects. Much that is environmental is hard to characterize that way. Many of the things that we do, for example, have to do with saving human life. Hard to figure out what a human life is worth, and in different circumstances, there are calculations that say that a human life is worth anything from $750,000 to north of $10 million. There are others who would say a human life is invaluable. You should pay any price in order to save a human being. Yeah, I don't know how you get through all of that, but that's something where environmentally we often take it outside a price regime. There's something called the General Sherman tree in Sequoia National Park. It's the biggest tree probably in the world. If somebody said, well, I'd like to turn that tree into shingles, what do I have to pay you? We can't sell the General Sherman tree for $1 million or for $100 million or for $1 billion. It's in our national park. We put up there and we said this is invaluable. We will protect it from whatever. And you see something akin to that runs through much of the environment. What is it worth to save a species and you're not sure exactly what role that species plays in any ecosystem? We've set up in the Endangered Species Act something that assigns an enormously high value to protecting endangered species, partly because we don't know what role so many of them do play. It's a little bit like disassembling an airplane as you're flying along and you don't know what parts are really vital, but you really don't want to throw away any of them. So in any case, I coming out of Earth Day and moving on toward the other 365 days of the year, I'm just hoping that people will reflect upon what it is that they most treasure about the world around them, what they most would like to pass on to their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and make that an essential part of the value system by which they lead their lives.
I know you mentioned that you had big plans for this year and those have changed a bit, but I want to make sure that our viewers are really clear on what you are planning to do. I believe there are some plans once we are able to emerge from our quarantine bunkers here. And I want to make sure that people are aware that there are still ways to celebrate and still ways to help.
Well, first, today, right on Earth Day, you can go to your computers, look at earthday.org, and there will be many hours of streaming content that you can enjoy, learn from while you're sheltering at home. We had arranged that originally Pope Francis was going to be giving a talk to a huge crowd in St. Peter's Square. Well, now it's illegal to have a huge crowd in St. Peter's Square, but Pope Francis will be on our streaming webinar today, again at earthday.org. As will several heads of state. We'll have some musicians that are playing from their living rooms. We'll have some scientists talking. We'll have a couple of comedians. We might have some film strips. It will not have the same kind of impact as 750,000 protesters on the National Mall, but it is a way to quietly and independently and yet together think about the big issues that are facing us. There will be, in a lot of different communities, things that will be following up as efforts that were originally planned for Earth Day that are going to take place later. In my hometown, Seattle, there are, as part of this Earth Day, a series of 5 plans. This is what are you going to do in the 5 days after Earth Day, the 5 months after Earth Day, the 5 years after Earth Day, and the 5 decades after this Earth Day. Tried to get companies to pledge, labor unions to pledge, religions to pledge, and individuals to pledge, and all of that will be sorted out. And hopefully this will not be something that is said, pledged, and forgotten, but that the organization will continue to try to follow up with people. we will not have anything that is akin to what was originally planned, where literally we hope to have more than 1 billion people in very visible ways stand up around the planet to say, we've been messing around now for 40 years on climate change. We're reaching some tipping points that will be irreversibly impoverishing the planet. And we've just now finally got to get bold. And there's no way to do that except through human bodies that we've discovered so far. And then we do not have the capacity to sort of say, well, can't do it on April 22nd. Let's do it on October 3rd. It's just it's just not something that can be shifted like that. Don't have the financial resources, among other things, to do it. So that won't happen.
Do you have any tips that you're encouraging people to start thinking about, or things that they can be doing from their homes? I know Earth Day Network has started sharing a number of things like that, but any that are particularly important to you, or that you would tell people to start with in solidarity for Earth Day?
It's kind of remarkable how consistent these things have been over the last 50 years. Some of them vary in importance. 50 years ago, we would have said, if you're choosing a vehicle, try to choose an automobile that is relatively small and does not pollute very much. Well, after the Clean Air Act's implementation, we've really cleaned up automobile pollution extraordinarily. The nitrous oxides, the particulates that used to come out of tailpipes have been reduced between 95 and 98%. So you can't really buy a dirty car today. You can buy an electric car, which makes it even better today. There are some places where institutionally we've made such progress that you no longer give that as advice to people. Today, I guess I'd say we've all learned from sheltering in place that for those of us that have the good fortune to have jobs that can be done at our homes, if you can persuade your employer to let you stay home for 1 day a week and to work out of your home, if everyone could do that, that would reduce the demand for office space by 20%, because 1 out of 5 people would be missing each day. It would reduce the amount of congestion by 1/5, and hence the time that is wasted. It would reduce the amount of energy used in commuting by 1/5. Really small steps, but it then gives you that time to be productive, that time to spend with your family, that time to maybe just relax, as opposed to being wrangling your way through a morning commute. People are now eating at home that used to be mostly eating in restaurants, and that allows you to honestly know the quality of the food that's going in, and not prepare giant meals like you're often served in restaurants, where 1/3 of it goes back and gets thrown away. At home, you cook as much as you need, and if it turns out you've got a little extra, it goes in the refrigerator and becomes leftovers. It's more efficient. All of these little benefits that hurt nothing and can make your life more pleasant, many of those I hope will continue even after COVID-19 has receded to being a distant memory.
Yeah.
Some small parts of this thing actually are. It's hard to say this in a disease that is affecting millions and killing tens of thousands, but there are parts of it that we can learn from that are actually an improvement over life without it.
Well, yeah, and that actually, first of all, I'm learning I am much more resourceful in the kitchen than I ever thought I could be. But yeah, that actually gets to my last question. In quarantine, actually, the waste industry is starting to pick up. They're starting to see increases in waste volumes out of residential homes because people are spending more time at home. They're using more packaging. That's probably been transferred from other sectors, but we're also, on the flip side, we're seeing, less people are using transportation. We're not traveling. We're spending a lot more time at home and being reflective. And I think we're all excited to get back to normal, but I think we all know that we will define a new normal, when we emerge from this. And I would love to kind of hear your picture of, how the pandemic has possibly helped the climate, and also, how we can see this as a truly new beginning and a fresh start, so that we can make different choices, once we come out of quarantine.
Well, there's a huge number of small things and a handful of big things. If last year we were going to do this interview, either you or I would have had to have traveled a few hundred miles with a video camera to do it. Now, connecting via Zoom has become commonplace. I have had maybe 8 Zoom conversations today. I had none 2 months ago. I'm not talking particularly about that. There's Google Hangouts, there's Skype, there's all of these technologies, but Zoom has really caught on for group meetings and went from under 10 million calls per day to more than 200 million calls today in less than a month. And if something is growing that well and is convenient and is improving and is getting better privacy features and what have you over time, being used increasingly for medical evaluations when you talk to your doctor on this, as opposed to going down to a place where you might be exposed to some diseases in an appointment. I think it will be something that will endure because it's better than what preceded it. And at the same time, it's saving all of that energy and saving all of that time.
I want to, before we wrap up, where can people learn more about Earth Day Network and to donate to the cause, especially if they can't participate in events this year?
Yes, thank you. I mean, it's like so many organizations, the Earth Day Network gets a significant part of its really flexible, discretionary, non-project oriented money from a big dinner that we host each year. And to do that for the 50th anniversary was going to be a dinner that we were really counting on. And that too has been canceled. So fundraising has become something that for us, as for so very many organizations in the not-for-profit space and the for-profit space, has become kind of a dire concern. With it, it's a remarkably easy web address to remember. It is earthday.org. And you can find in it all kinds of educational materials, tutorials on lots of subjects, and interesting press extracts that is constantly being updated each day, as well as today looking at it for this video presentation that will be going on for several hours, drawing upon interesting people from around the world and allowing them all to feel connected. A lack of information shouldn't be anybody's problem. The world right now in this information era has a lot of good, reliable information there. What we need is for people to look into their hearts, to ask what's really important to them, and to make a commitment to do what's necessary to get that accomplished.
Yeah, that's very well said. Well, while I feel like there's so much ahead of us and so much work to be done, I want to pause and thank you and your generation for all the hard work you've put in. I'm a child of the 80s, and supposedly we were supposed to have masks, supposed to have to wear masks for air quality by the 1980s. And I had a childhood where I played outside and breathed clean air. And so thank you for all the wins that your generation is passing on to us. And I hope we can carry the torch and handle the challenges that are in front of us. All right. Well, thanks so much and happy Earth Day.
And happy Earth Day to you as well. Take care.
Bye.